Today, or the day that this video goes live, is April 22nd. On this day, 12 years ago in 2007, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl finally released in the United States. I still vividly remember going to the mall to pick up my copy of Pearl version, and it was probably the most excited I've ever been to pick up a new Pokemon game ever. I was only 11 years old at the time, and this was also around the time that I really started to use the internet. I would spend so many hours on YouTube, which was fairly new at the time, as well as other Pokemon related sites such as Cerebi, looking for news about Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. I would check Cerebi religiously, pretty much every single day, hoping there would be a new post about information on the game. The game released a few months prior in Japan, of course, so I got to see a lot of information from that, and once I finally got my hands on my Pearl version, I was not disappointed. Now, there's no denying that I am a pretty huge Pokemon fan. Nostalgia might play a huge factor in my love for the franchise, but Pokemon Diamond and Pearl are still some of my favorites in the series. I even just recently played through Diamond version again about a month ago on stream, and I have to say it really does still hold up today. Today I want to discuss what makes Pokemon Diamond and Pearl so special in honor of their anniversary, as well as why they can be considered the best Pokemon games. Sure, they do have their flaws, being the first main series Pokemon games on the Nintendo DS system, but there's still a lot to love here. One of the first things that I think of when it comes to Pokemon Diamond and Pearl is the new evolutions introduced in this generation. The 4th generation gave us many fantastic evolutions like Electivire, Tangrowth, Mismagius, and my personal favorite, Yanmega. These were all very welcome additions to older Pokemon, and it's hard to believe that outside of Sylveon, in X and Y, we haven't received any new evolutions to older Pokemon since Generation 4 with Diamond and Pearl. Hopefully this changes with Generation 8 in Sword and Shield, as I still think there's a ton of Pokemon out there in need of a Mega Evolution, such as Maractus, who I would love to see evolve. Now, another thing that people are quickly to point out when it comes to discussing if a Pokemon game is considered good or not is the story or the plot. Generation 5 and 7 are usually praised amongst Pokemon fans as having the best stories, although for me personally, I never really cared too much about the story in a Pokemon game. As long as it involves becoming the champion, has a fun gameplay, and a well-designed region that's fun to explore, I'm all for it. I will totally put gameplay over story in a Pokemon game any day. Now, the story in Diamond and Pearl revolves around Team Galactic, whose goal involves capturing the cover legendary Pokemon, as pretty much every Pokemon Evil team does, and rebuilding the Pokemon Galaxy with them. Dialga is the Pokemon responsible for controlling time, and Pearl is responsible for controlling space, so there's a lot of damage they can do with those two Pokemon. It's your job to take them down at various points in the game, and the thing I really like about them the most is it's never too intrusive on the overall gameplay. One of my biggest complaints about Pokemon Sun and Moon is that at times it feels like the story, so to say, is forced within the game, and it just gets annoying at times and breaks up the pace in a rather awkward way in my opinion. Team Galactic doesn't appear all that often within the games, but they appear often enough to be remembered, and they have some memorable allies such as Cyrus and Mars. One complaint I do have about Team Galactic, however, is the interaction you have with them leading into Pastoria City. You're supposed to talk to this random grunt in front of the Great Marsh and chase him down, but as a kid I remember getting confused at this point and not knowing what to do. Luckily this issue was made a little bit more clear in Platinum version, the definitive editions of Diamond and Pearl, where they did manage to change the order of the gyms to make it a little bit less confusing. Aside from this hiccup with the Galactic Grunt in Diamond and Pearl, the rest of the region is pretty straightforward. You arrive in the region's hub-like town, Jubilife City, rather early on in the game before you get any badges, which connects to 3 other routes besides the one that you just came from. The west route is only accessible later in the game in order to go to Kanalave City, where the 7th gym is located, so you do have to return there later in the game, which I do like when Pokemon games do that and make you revisit older areas in a way that feels natural. Now, the big difference between Jubilife City over most other big hub cities in Pokemon games is the lack of a department store. The department store in Diamond and Pearl is located in Veilstone City, which also houses the Game Corner, a big Team Galactic building, and a gym. This city also acts like a second hub-like town in a way, being in the middle of the region and connecting up a lot of points of interest. I'm actually a fan of this as it makes other towns feel more important as opposed to having that one main town that everything is focused on, such as the Johto region and Goldenrod City. You could even battle a couple of the gyms out of order in Diamond and Pearl, which adds for some diversity within your gameplay, and allows for more replayability since you can play through the game a little bit differently every time. You can take on the fighting gym leader Maylene in Veilstone City first if your team is more prepared for fighting type Pokemon, or battle Crasher Wake and his water type Pokemon in Pastoria City if you prefer to take on water type Pokemon at that point in the game. This allows you to train up a little bit for the gym that you're a little bit weaker against to make you feel more prepared. There's also no level cap between these two gym leaders in Diamond and Pearl either, so either way you don't have to worry about battling over-leveled or under-leveled Pokemon, which is very nice for you. This was also changed in Platinum, where Crasher Wake's Pokemon are a bit higher levels than Maylene, which is just one of the many small changes Platinum added on top of Diamond and Pearl. All of the gym leaders in this game, except for the 7th and 8th one, only have 3 Pokemon as well. This makes it a little bit less of a challenge compared to other games, but each gym leader does at least have 1 Pokemon capable of giving you trouble. Crasher Wake's Gyarados in particular was scary for me, as in my most recent playthrough I was doing a Nuzlocke and struggled against the type combination of water and flying with the team that I had. Maylene's Lucario gave me a lot of trouble massacring my team. And the final 2 gym leaders have an extra Pokemon that isn't even a part of the same typing as the gym, which can catch you off guard, especially when you're playing through this game for the first time. Now when it comes to battling the gym leaders and deciding on if you want to battle Maylene or Crasher Wake first, you actually have a pretty decent amount of time to decide who you want to battle first, as the gap between the 2nd and the 3rd gym is pretty large in Diamond and Pearl. I personally don't have too much of an issue with this, as I do enjoy it when Pokemon games allow you to explore the region in a way that feels natural. As in Diamond and Pearl, you do have to go to Floroma Town, do some Team Galactic interactions, and overall it doesn't feel out of place, but it is a little annoying having a big gap between these 2 gyms, and then 2 gyms back to back in Maylene and Crasher Wake right after that. This is the strangest gym pacing in a Pokemon game so far, as there's another pretty decent gap when it comes to battling the 7th and 8th gym leader as well. This is mostly because the 7th gym leader is located all the way up in Snow Point City, which is in the far north of the region, and no other town is really near there, forcing you to go all the way back to Sunny Shore, which you have to do some Team Galactic stuff in between in order to get to Sunny Shore because it's being blocked off by some random guy. Badges 3 through 7 are sandwiched pretty close together as well, which makes the ending of the game feel a lot more faster than the start, since you will get your first 4 badges a little bit slower than your last 4. Now continuing on in the Sinnoh region, it has a fair bit of diversity when it comes to the region. If you were to compare Sinnoh to something like Kanto, all of Kanto's cities are relatively similar in terms of design, have a very similar climate, with the only real exception being Cinnabar Island being a tropical island south of Pallet Town. I really like how Sinnoh has Snow Point City, which was the first Pokemon town to be completely covered in snow. Then you have the big city style of Jubilife, the beachy Sunny Shore City, and Kanalave City, which is more focused on being a port, more so than any other port-like city before it, as Vermilion just sort of has a little port tacked onto the side of it. This diversity is what I think adds a lot of charm to the Sinnoh region, and it was the first time Game Freak really tried to add diversity in a Pokemon games region. This only continued as we got newer regions, and looking at the map of Galar that we have now, I think this will continue with Sword and Shield with how diverse this map looks. Now, although I do love these games, and they are still some of my favorite all-time Pokemon games in the franchise, they aren't perfect. Diamond and Pearl are notorious for running rather slow, and having this strange screen-tearing-like effect while playing through the game. This is very noticeable while playing through the game. I even noticed it as a kid playing this game at 11 years old, and a lot of this is attributed to Diamond and Pearl being the first main series Pokemon game on the Nintendo DS console. Luckily, they did end up fixing these issues with newer DS Pokemon games, and the new DS models help too. I'm not really sure if this is excusable or not, as Diamond and Pearl did release about 2 years after the release of the DS, meaning they did have plenty of time to work out all the kinks and make the game run a lot smoother, especially compared to other games released at the time. There was also a lot of smaller gameplay issues as well, like we discussed earlier with the gym leaders, and a lot of this was fixed in Platinum, thankfully. Although this next point doesn't exactly have to do with the Sinnoh region as a whole or Diamond and Pearl as a game, and it is more so introduced because of the capabilities that the Nintendo DS had over its predecessor consoles, and that's the online functionalities introduced in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. As a kid, I always dreamt of being able to play a Pokemon game online in some capacity. I remember playing the Game Boy Advance Pokemon games with my friends all the time, but that relied on having link cables, which broke a ton and not a lot of people had. With the release of Diamond and Pearl, I was finally able to battle with friends online, which opened up so much more possibilities. It was also around this time that I would go on Pokemon forums even more to find battles or trade partners, since unfortunately Diamond and Pearl didn't feature any options to battle against random opponents or trade against random opponents unless you count the GTS. The GTS was the only exception when it comes to trading against random opponents, and I spent so much time on the GTS as a kid tracking down specific Pokemon that I needed. Diamond and Pearl's official online service was unfortunately shut down by Nintendo back in 2014, but luckily there are still some ways around this to play DS Pokemon games online in some capacity. It's a little annoying to set up and it doesn't work perfectly like it used to, but I was able to do it and it brought back so many memories of playing Pearl as a kid and tracking down those specific Pokemon on the GTS. Now of course, with the introduction of the Nintendo DS being able to connect online, Diamond and Pearl was also the introduction of Wi-Fi events, which was a huge game changer as well. Prior to Diamond and Pearl, I remember how much of a hassle it was to get legitimate events Pokemon from various places. I remember going to Toys R Us and waiting in line to connect my Game Boy Advance up to a machine to receive an event Mew, and I remember going to the Nintendo store in Manhattan to get this cool Flygon in my Sapphire version, which again I had to plug my cartridge into a Game Boy in order to get it. Being able to have Wi-Fi events made it a lot easier to get these Pokemon events as well, as not everyone had access to a Toys R Us or some other store for these event Pokemon, and now you can just go online and connect to get these Pokemon. You also can't talk about Pokemon Diamond and Pearl without at least mentioning Cynthia. Cynthia is arguably the most notorious champion, famous for her powerful team. The Elite Four has a pretty decent level jump from the 8th gym leader Volcaner, and once you reach Cynthia, she has one of the strongest teams I've ever seen from an NPC in any Pokemon game, led by her level 66 Garchomp. She is viewed as one of the hardest trainers in all of Pokemon, as if you don't go out of your way to have your team straight up counter hers, you're gonna have a very difficult time relying on a lot of healing items. She's my personal favorite champion as well, due to her insanely cool team, involvement in the story, and her overall attitude and design. Another thing that people are quick to point out when it comes to discussing a Pokemon game is the post-game. For whatever reason, Pokemon, unlike most other franchises, is held to some standard of having some sort of post-game activities to do after the main game is finished by becoming the champion of the Elite Four. Gold and Silver are widely considered to be the best when it comes to post-game, as they allow you to travel through a condensed version of Kanto, but Diamond and Pearl still have plenty for the player to do after they beat the main game. The player can head up north of the Pokemon Link to reveal 3 new town-like areas: the Resort Area, Survival Area, and Fighting Area. The Fighting Area houses a Battle Frontier, the Survival Area is a rather lackluster Diamond and Pearl, but gets improvements in Platinum luckily, and the Resort Area houses a spa for grooming your Pokemon, and the Ribbon Counter, which sells expensive ribbons for no real purpose. In Platinum, you're even given your own house on the Resort Area, which is yet another small improvement added to Platinum version from Diamond and Pearl. So with all that being said, happy 12th anniversary to Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. These games are not perfect by any means, but they are still very special Pokemon games that are fun to play even to this day. You can argue that Pokemon Platinum version is better in just about every single way, since it mostly just improves upon Diamond and Pearl while keeping the overall idea intact, but that shouldn't take away from what Diamond and Pearl started. There's been a lot of buzz lately about wanting a Diamond and Pearl remake for the Switch, and maybe after Sword and Shield we could finally get one. If we do end up getting a Diamond and Pearl remake in the near future, I just hope it can capture the same charms and feelings as the original Diamond and Pearl did for me as a kid.